This is Charlie. Half of his breakfast always ends up on the floor. And he leaves fur everywhere. That's why I grabbed the Bissell Power Clean Fur Finder. It's cordless, powerful, and actually finds fur you don't even see. Learn more at Bissell.com.
Retirement isn't just about closing out your career. It's mornings that begin with a sunrise instead of an alarm, and the freedom to live the life you've always dreamed of. With a New York Life financial professional, you'll have the guidance to make it real, so your years of hard work become the life you've always imagined. Your life. New York Life. More powerful together. Start today at nyl.com.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 45 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. For the past few weeks, we have been exploring early American reform movements. In episode 43, Matthew Osborne revealed information about medical reform and the temperance movement. Last week in episode 44, Adam Sprintzen led us on an exploration of the vegetarian movement. And I don't know about you, but that episode left me pretty hungry. The Second Great Awakening, a Protestant revival movement that peaked between 1800 and 1840, inspired many of these reform movements, as did the start of the Industrial Revolution and the Transportation Revolution. These revolutions changed the American economy and the way people worked and traveled. Today we will explore yet another movement that came about during the early Republic, Mormonism. Spencer McBride, an editor with the Joseph Smith Papers documentary editing project, joins us to explore the life of Joseph Smith and his work to found and spread Mormonism. During our conversation, Spencer reveals who Joseph Smith was and information about his revelation story, how Smith saw Mormonism as fitting within the Christian religious tradition, and details about the Mormons' westward migration from New York to Utah. Are you ready to travel once more into the 19th century? I am. So let me introduce to you our guide, Spencer McBride.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Spencer McBride is an historian of early America and a documentary editor at the Joseph Smith Papers. His research interests include the intersection of religion and political culture during the American Revolution and the early American Republic. Spencer's book isn't available yet, but it is tentatively titled The Pulpit and the Nation, Clergymen and the Politics of Revolutionary America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Spencer.
Thanks, Liz. I'm happy to be here with you.
Today we are going to explore the life and times of Joseph Smith, who founded Mormonism in the 19th century. But before we dive into Smith's life, let's talk about you, Spencer. Would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in early American history?
Sure. I was born and raised in California. I had a father who had been a history major in college, and history discussions were frequent at our dinner table and in the regular course of the day. So I always kind of had this love of history. And then when I was in the 8th grade, actually, I decided that I wanted to be a historian. I had a United States history teacher, really caught my attention and got me to think deeply about the past. And as I continued each step of my education, my passion for the subject increased. I went on to get a master's degree and a PhD, both in history, from Louisiana State University. And so I really consider myself pretty lucky that I'm doing now as an adult what I dreamed of doing when I was only 13 years old. And I know that's not necessarily common for people to look back and think.
Wow, that's a fantastic story. Let's transition to Joseph Smith. Would you tell us about Smith and his revelation story?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Joseph Smith's story really gets going in the year 1820. Smith was a 14-year-old boy living in a small town in New York called Palmyra. And here in 1820, this was in the midst of a religious movement historians call the Second Great Awakening, an awakening that was characterized by a rapid increase among Americans in religious activity. It's a movement that's perhaps best typified by an evangelical revival meeting. These meetings were happening throughout the country, and a lot of them were happening in upstate New York where Smith was living. As Smith later wrote in his personal history, he was interested in this religious fervor, but quickly became confused by the conflicting messages of the different denominations that were vying for converts in his town. He wrote that he wondered which of all the different churches he should join, and if one of them was somehow more true to the teachings of Jesus than all the others. But because every denomination appealed to the same book, they all pointed to the Bible, sometimes even the same verses, to prove their correctness and the falseness or the falsehoods being taught by other churches. Smith found himself really unconvinced by all of them. And so, according to his later accounts, he decided to pray and ask God which church he should join. And he accordingly went into the woods near his family's farm, and he later recounted that he says he had a vision in which God and Jesus appeared to him and told him to join none of the churches that were vying for his attention, for his membership, and that they would restore the Church of Jesus Christ through him, which, as we'll talk about, was quite a controversial claim that made a lot of people very upset. And now, as a part of this restoration effort, and what a lot of people have heard about is that Smith recorded several encounters with an angel. An angel, he said, directed him to a set of golden plates or golden tablets buried in a hillside, and that these plates contained a record of God's dealings with some of the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Americas. And Smith told his followers, or would-be followers, that he translated and published this record as the Book of Mormon in 1830. And it was in that same year that he founded what became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I guess in a nutshell, that's kind of the start of Joseph Smith as a religious leader.
I'd like us to talk about those golden tablets for a moment. So in 2014, I attended the New York State History Conference, and I heard a paper that talked about the tablets. And the person giving the paper mentioned that they had special characters on them that no one could read. Would you tell us how Smith translated those characters into the Book of Mormon?
Yes, and that's a really good question that's been asked almost from the time he first introduced the Book of Mormon. Smith described the characters that were on these plates or the tablet as being a kind of reformed Egyptian. In fact, that's the actual term that is used at one point in the text of the Book of Mormon, characters that are reformed Egyptian. But he did not actually leave a detailed account of his translation process. In the preface of the Book of Mormon, he writes that he translated the record he says, these are his words, by the gift and power of God. But he doesn't, as much as we would love him to, he did not really elaborate from there. But what we do know is that Joseph Smith did not know Reformed Egyptian. So that this was not a translation by the most common meaning of that word, wherein someone who is fluent in two languages translates a passage word for word. Someone who is fluent in Spanish and English can translate the same passage back and forth. It doesn't appear to have been that translation by any sense of that word. And scholars of religion generally, and Mormon history specifically, they devote a lot of time and attention to this question and continue to debate with one another about the ins and outs of how Smith could or could not have translated this record. But as for documented claims by Smith himself, all we're really left with is these type of statements that he did it by the gift and power of God.
You mentioned that Smith's revelation story is one where he asked God, what church should I join? Because he wanted religion, but he wasn't sure which church to join. After his revelation, how did Smith see Mormonism as fitting within the Christian tradition?
Yeah, that question raises a really interesting point, because Because Mormons today, as Mormons back in Smith's day did, they adamantly declare themselves to be Christian, but they don't claim to be Protestant or to be Protestant Christians. So their place in the broad Christian tradition is as what you might call a restorationist movement. The Smith did not lead a break from another denomination, as other famous Protestant leaders did. Instead, he claimed to have restored to the world what he said was the form of Christianity established by Jesus himself. So accordingly, he explained while he was alive that Jesus had organized a church and bestowed upon the men he put in charge of that church with the authority to teach his doctrine and perform religious rites. Smith claimed that with the death of the apostles that Jesus had put in place, there was a general falling away, or they would use the word apostasy sometimes in describing this, in which the doctrine was corrupted, the organization was fundamentally altered, and the authority to lead the church lost. And these type of claims weren't unique to Joseph Smith necessarily. A lot of the early Reformationist leaders made similar claims in their rebuke of the Catholic Church. But it's in this type of thinking that Smith comes during the 1800s and declares that the church and gospel of Jesus Christ had been restored through him, and that he was a prophet who spoke with God and who he said had been appointed to lead the church much in the same way that biblical figures such as Abraham, Moses, or Peter had claimed to communicate with the divine and claimed that they had been appointed to lead people in the name of God. So essentially, the faith of Smith's followers, it consists of a belief in Jesus Christ and a belief in the idea of prophets, that God had previously spoken to mankind through prophets and that he continued to do so in modern days. And I know this sounds like a kind of a complicated answer to your question, but it demonstrates, I think, how Mormons can be Christians but fit neither the Catholic nor the Protestant categories that they are commonly invoked to describe a group's position in the Christian tradition.
No, that's great. Thank you for breaking down those complexities for us. Now, how did Smith work to spread the word of Mormonism? Did he hold revivals, knock on doors, and write pamphlets and articles like the leaders of the other religious movements of the Second Great Awakening?
He did some writing. He wrote his history, or made several attempts to write his history, though that wouldn't necessarily be published during his lifetime. He would sometimes write open letters that were published. But he relied a great deal on missionary work. His early followers traveled to nearby towns with copies of the Book of Mormon to tell people about the idea of prophets and a restoration of Jesus' church. And within the first decade after Smith had founded the church, he had already dispatched missionaries to Canada, England, and Europe, in addition to areas within the United States. And he himself had even undertaken some of these missions, including a mission to Canada. But in the very early years, church membership we see grew along kinship networks. So essentially, one person would become convinced of the truth of Smith's claims, and then he or she would share these ideas with their immediate and extended families. In fact, and I think this is actually kind of a really interesting story, if I understand it correctly, there was a single copy of the Book of Mormon that was passed around in a New York family by the last name of Young that ultimately led many in that family to begin following Joseph Smith. And that included Brigham Young, who would become famous as Smith's successor and the one who ultimately led church members to the Salt Lake Valley in the years following Smith's death. And as for how his neighbors and other Americans received his message, perhaps the best answer I could say is that the reaction was mixed. There were many who were intrigued by his ideas. Many of his early followers had experienced something similar to Smith, where they had seen so many different Christian denominations vying for their membership, and they wondered which of all of them was the right choice. But there were others who readily dismissed Smith, people that derided him as, at best, being deluded, and at worst, claiming that Smith was a charlatan, a man who was creating a religious movement in order to obtain for himself power and social position. And even before he published the Book of Mormon, his critics started circulating potential explanations of how the book could have come into existence, explanations that would disprove Smith's claims of divine interaction if they could gain traction. And so you really had this kind of mixed reception of Smith's preaching.
Many of us associate Utah with Mormonism. Would you tell us when and why the Mormons traveled from New York to Utah and what their journey was like?
Yeah, well, the easy answer to that is they moved west because people kept on kicking them out of their cities and their places. The Mormons had a tendency to gather, and in gathering, they often angered and alienated themselves with local populations. So Smith himself only remained in New York for a short while after founding the church. He experienced heavy opposition there and was drawn to Ohio, where missionaries had experienced a great deal of early success. And so Smith and the church set up shop in a suburb of what is today a suburb of Cleveland called Kirtland, Ohio. But Smith had also prophesied to his early followers that the city of the New Jerusalem, or Zion, that is spoken of in the book of Revelation, would be built by them in western Missouri. So even as Mormons were gathering in Ohio, another group was gathering in Missouri. And what ultimately happened during the 1830s is that the non-Mormons in these areas, not really liking the doctrine the Mormons were teaching, not liking their claims that they communed with God, but also fearing that the Mormons would soon become so large as a group that they'd be a voting bloc that would control local elections, or united population that would control local economies. A lot of these anti-Mormon residents in Ohio and Missouri took it upon themselves to be vigilantes and to use violence and intimidation and to force the Mormons to leave their community. So Smith and the Mormons eventually left Ohio and Missouri. And in Missouri, they were actually expelled by order of the governor, who said that they needed to be driven from the state or exterminated. They regroup in Illinois, and things are going well there for a time. And then you get into the mid-1840s, and the violence and opposition is coming up again. And ultimately, Brigham Young, in the years following the death of Joseph Smith, leads the main body of the church to Utah. And it's an agonizing trip. It was rough, as any westward migration was at that time. There were many who did not survive the trip. And those that did survive the trip, once they arrived, they had the task of starting over from scratch and building a city and a society.
There's so many directions we could go with this story, but before we move on, it sounds to me like it was really the ideas that Joseph Smith and his followers were promoting that caused people in these communities to want the Mormons to leave them. Was that the case, or was there something else about the Mormons that people wanted out of their community?
I think it was a mix. And as we look at religious controversies throughout the 19th century, particularly in the United States, there seems to clearly be popular disdain for religions that are different, religions that are kind of outside mainstream Christianity. And so there's sometimes prejudice based off another's religious belief. But I also think it would be a mistake if we ever discounted non-religious aspects of these tense relations. There's real traction to the idea that people in Missouri would see a group of Mormons that gathered and interacted with each other as one day controlling all the local elections, or that they would only do business with each other. And they did have that tendency to mainly do business with each other. So if you're non-Mormon, you kind of feel like you're on the outside of this group. This is a group that's threatening your way of life as they might see it. And so you really get that mixture. And I think if the Mormons hadn't had that tendency to gather in one or two places like they did, tensions may have been far less than they ultimately were.
Before we leave the idea of the Mormons' westward trek, Sarah and Renee would like to know more about it. Sarah would like to know if Joseph Smith had a specific vision for the West and Mormon life in it. And Renee would like to know if the Mormons' westward migration affected their theology in any way.
Yeah, so Smith, like a lot of Americans of his time, saw the Western United States, or the areas that are now part of the Western United States, kind of as a land of promise, a place where an injured people could go and seek refuge. And there appears to be references in some of Joseph Smith's papers and those writing about him as early as 1831, in which references to the Rocky Mountains are made as a potential refuge for him and his followers. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he foresaw a journey to what we call today Utah way back then, but that he was actively looking to the west as a place he and his people might one day retreat if they had to. As for how the westward migration to Utah affected Mormon theology, I'm not aware of any straightforward examples of such an occurrence. But what does clearly happen, and I think this is actually a really interesting development, is that Mormon culture changes drastically in Utah in a way that impacts how members of the church talked about their theology. So the relative isolation they experienced in Utah seems to have allowed them to preach with greater candor about doctrines and ideas that would have been controversial in the eastern United States when they're surrounded by non-Mormon populations. They could openly talk about ideas and doctrines that would have elicited a violent backlash from non-Mormon neighbors, doctrines that would include most notably that of polygamy or plural marriage. But in the Utah Territory, it appears that they felt much more at liberty to speak openly about some of these doctrines. So I see the westward migration having less of an impact on Mormon theology per se, but the change in Mormon culture allowing them to speak more openly about that theology.
You mentioned that Joseph Smith died in Illinois, and I'd really like to get to that story. But before we kill off Joseph Smith in our story here, April would really like to know about Joseph Smith's relationship with his wife and whether he experienced any controversy when he introduced polygamy to his followers. And I guess even before we get to April's question, we should really discuss how Smith came to his belief in polygamy.
It's a very good question and a very common question. It's one of the things people are very interested in knowing about Joseph Smith. He appears to have arrived quite early in his experience as a leader of the church at this belief that in certain times and under certain conditions, God sanctioned the practice of men having more than one wife at one time. His revelations on plural marriage, and they would often use that term plural marriage as opposed to polygamy, though when I use them, it essentially meaning the same thing. These seem to have initially arisen out of his study of the Old Testament, because in that book, there are several examples of God sanctioning what is, in effect, polygamy for men such as Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom had more than one wife at one time. And I think this got Joseph Smith thinking about why this was so. There are also people, some of Smith's contemporaries, who recorded accounts of him telling of an angel appearing to him and commanding him to reveal this doctrine of plural marriage. But the actual revelation, it appears he committed to writing for the first time in 1843, along with this idea that marriage, this is some really new insights on marriage, that it wasn't just till death do you part, as commonly spoken of in legal religious ceremonies that join a man and woman together, but that it could last for eternity, that you could be bound together or sealed beyond death. And so it was all kind of in the same frame of reference that this revelation on plural marriage came out. Now, as for the other parts of the question, they tie directly into this in some ways. Smith had a very strong relationship with his first wife, Emma. They seem to, at least in the surviving letters that they wrote to each other, they have a strong mutual affection and concern for each other's well-being. As parents, they frequently express great love for their children. I wish we had more letters between these two than those that have survived. But these characteristics really shine through their surviving letters. But then comes the question of how did polygamy impact their relationship? Or at least how did Emma Smith respond to this idea of Joseph taking more than one wife? And she really kind of vacillates between support for the idea and then also at other times using her influence in the community to undermine the practice. I think there's a lot more that we don't know about this than what we do. But as historians continue to dig through archives and look through surviving documents, I believe we're getting a better understanding of their dynamic within their marriage than ever before.
Was Smith's marriage to Emma before or after he developed his idea about plural marriage?
It was before.
I know we've talked about the Mormons movement out west, but you mentioned earlier that Smith had been in Illinois. How did Smith come to Illinois, which is also the place where he would die?
Yeah, so after he left Ohio, he was in Missouri for a short time. And then, things got really bad in 1838. There's what was termed the Mormon War, in which vigilantes, eventually in league with the state militia, took up arms against the Mormons of Missouri, who in turn took up arms to defend themselves, and shots were fired. People were killed on both sides. Ultimately, Joseph Smith was imprisoned, and the Mormons were expelled from the state of Missouri by executive order from that state's governor. Eventually, Smith and company escaped from prison. Some have argued quite convincingly that their guards had let them escape. But either way, the Saints kind of regroup in western Illinois and found a new city called Nauvoo, a city that Joseph eventually becomes the mayor of. So he's simultaneously exercising authority as president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and mayor of the town of Nauvoo, where the majority of church members actually resided.
Smith dies at the relatively young age of 38. Would you tell us about the circumstances of his early demise?
Yeah, so he was murdered. A group of more than 100 men who had painted their faces black to mask their identities, stormed a jail cell where Joseph was being held in June 1844 and shot him and his brother Hiram. And really, kind of as I mentioned before, at this time, as support for Smith was growing and his religious movement, at the same time, there was staunch opposition. There had been attempts by Missourians to kidnap Smith in Illinois and bring him back to Missouri to stand trial because he was accused of being behind an assassination attempt on the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, the same governor that had forced the Mormons out of Missouri. There were disaffected Mormons who believed that he was a fallen prophet, in large part because of his revelations on polygamy. And these disaffected Mormons claimed that he was leading his followers by delusion. There were non-Mormon citizens of Illinois who viewed Smith as exercising too much power and influence in the rapidly growing Mormon community. They felt that he embodied kind of a dangerous combination of ecclesiastical and secular power, that no one person should wield so much power in each of these categories. And so really there were a lot of people who wanted to see Smith dead, and many who believed that once he was killed, they would essentially have cut off the head of the snake, or that with Smith dead, the movement he led would collapse and crumble. And it appears that in June 1844, a group of men with some combination of these motives were successful in taking his life.
Is there evidence that Smith was actually involved in a plot to kill the governor, or is the evidence that they used just trumped up?
A lot of people have argued that it's trumped up. It could have happened, but I would say there's not enough evidence to convict. And there are things to suspect that he actually had no involvement in it. The idea was that he had sent one of his personal bodyguards, a man named Porter Rockwell, to go and kill Boggs, and that the assassination attempt had failed. We do know that Porter Rockwell had been in Missouri, had gone back to Missouri from Illinois at that same time, but really that amounts to circumstantial evidence. It could have happened, but really there's no clear evidence that it did. But there were people who were still in Missouri who were still angry at Smith, and so it kind of seemed like he seemed like the natural scapegoat to others.
Would you tell us about the Joseph Smith Papers documentary editing project? How many papers did Smith leave behind, and what types of papers did he leave?
The Joseph Smith Papers project is really following the lead of other projects like the Benjamin Franklin Papers, or the papers of Thomas Jefferson, the papers of John Adams, and so forth, where you collect the surviving documents that these prominent historical figures left behind. Our comprehensive edition will really consist of more than 8,000 documents. Some of these are letters Joseph wrote or that people wrote to Joseph Smith. A lot of them are legal or financial papers, business records, sermons, discourses. There's really a wide array of documents that are in this project.
Is the project affiliated with the Church of Latter-day Saints?
It is. Our project is housed at the Church History Library in Salt Lake City. Our financial backing comes from both the church, but also from the generous philanthropy of the Larry H. Miller family, who support us in this work. But even though we have that ecclesiastical affiliation, there's great effort made as we produce these volumes of the series to make them academic and scholarly work of the highest caliber. So they're not devotional in that they're not put out to necessarily strengthen the faith of church members so much as they are put out to offer greater transparency of the life and ministry of Joseph Smith and to help explain this really curious historical figure to scholars of American history more generally.
So there could be letters in these documents that aren't necessarily favorable to Smith, but because they are meant to be academic and scholarly, they're included in the volumes.
Correct. We don't censor the volumes. It's all put out there, whether it paints Joseph Smith in a good light or a less favorable light. It's all going out there. Which would really, I think, be one of the major distinctions between a devotional religious project and a purely academic project. And we fall into that latter camp. Though we are affiliated with a religious institution, it's very much an academic and scholarly undertaking.
How many edited volumes does the Joseph Smith Papers intend to produce, and how many has it produced?
We will probably, when it's all said and done, have about 25 print volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers. 10 have been published to date. But not all of the documents will go into the actual print volumes. For instance, some of these documents are pretty mundane and repetitive. So over the course of his life and career, he signed just hundreds and hundreds of promissory notes or deeds, some of these legal and financial documents. So what we'll do is we'll put a few examples of those in the print volumes. But where our project will be comprehensive is on our website, josephsmithpapers.org. And it's there that we are publishing the original document. So you can go to josephsmithpapers.org and look at the high-resolution color image of the actual original document side by side with a transcription of what's in that document. And by the time the project's done, we plan to have every single Joseph Smith document that still exists and that we know about on that website.
That's fantastic. And is that free for anyone to use?
It is. No cost at all. Free and available to anyone and everyone.
Now it is time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
And Spencer, your Time Warp question is submitted by Chris. Spencer, in your opinion, what might have happened if Joseph Smith had lived longer? How would the Mormon journey to the West have been different?
So I think questions like this can be really fun, especially since there's a lot of different ways you can take a question like this. So just speculating here, the idea that had Smith lived longer, would the Mormons have still migrated to Utah? I think that the main body of the church would have left Nauvoo eventually because the opposition and the violence toward church members and Smith himself was really ramping up when you get to 1844. And as Smith and his fellow church leaders are appealing to the federal government for help, they're simultaneously making backup plans in case the federal government refuses to help them, to kind of help alleviate the opposition to their group and to protect them from mob violence. And they're looking at lots of different areas to which they could retreat if this had to happen. And it wasn't just Utah. In fact, there was a lot of interest in moving to either Oregon or Texas, which was then not part of the United States. In fact, in the last years of Smith's life, he was in negotiations with the governor of Texas, Sam Houston, seeking out a grant of land within Texas that church members could move to and establish kind of as their refuge. Similar to what they tried to do in Utah. So in answer to this time warp question, I think it is possible and interesting to think about that had Smith lived longer, the more we would talk of the Mormon migration not as a movement from Illinois to Salt Lake City, but as a movement from Illinois to Texas, which is really strange to our 21st century conceptions of the country, because we think of Utah often and its history being forever intertwined with that of the Mormons. But we'd think of Utah very differently, and we'd probably think of Texas very differently had the Mormons actually moved to Texas instead.
In a brief transition here back to actual history, you've piqued our interest. What were the negotiations like between Joseph Smith and Sam Houston to bring the Mormons to Texas?
And this is an area where I am far from an expert, though we do have some scholars here at the Smith Papers working on this very topic, and the documents associated will be published, I believe, next year. But the general idea was that they were seeking some tract of land where they could essentially go and establish themselves, almost as, I hate to say, a sovereign group within another sovereign country, but that's kind of the gist of it. They would be good, law-abiding citizens, but they wanted to live in essence, by themselves, because as we'd seen, their tendency to gather had caused problems with neighbors, no matter where they went. And so there were many who were convinced that the only way they would ever be able to practice their religion in peace would be to go to a place with very few people and kind of establish it as their home from the get-go. And so a lot of their negotiations with Sam Houston and their investigation of Texas as a potential refuge were along those lines. And though it's interesting to say that the Mormons were not the only people that saw a future in Texas, there were all sorts of groups that saw Texas as the answer to their problems in American society.
Fascinating. That sounds like fodder for a future conversation. Before we conclude, would you tell us what is next for you, the Joseph Smith Papers, and Pam would really like to know if there are any plans for a Brigham Young documentary editing project.
The Joseph Smith Papers actually have a very big year planned. We're releasing 2 different volumes in the coming months before 2015 is over. The first one we're going to release is going to be what we call the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. So when Joseph Smith was having the Book of Mormon printed, the very first edition in 1830, he had the manuscript that was in the handwriting of his scribe, and that was brought to the printer. And what we're doing is in a very large volume, we'll have on one page a high-resolution color image of the manuscript pages of the Book of Mormon. And on the page on the other side of the spine, we will have a diplomatic transcript, so line-by-line transcript of what the handwriting is saying. And so this will be a really big deal for scholars of the early Mormon past to have this volume out. A few months after that, we're publishing the 3rd volume in the Journals series of the Smith Papers. And it's the final volume in that series. So now interested readers and historians can read all of Joseph Smith's journals that he kept through his lifetime. They will all be available in print. And so the fact that we're publishing both of these volumes just months apart is very exciting for our project. As for the idea of a Brigham Young Papers type project, I think there'd be some very serious interest in such a project. However, I think it's a question that probably won't really come up in full serious consideration until we're farther along in the Joseph Smith Papers. We haven't even published half of our planned volumes yet, but I think that would be a very interesting project, and fingers crossed something like that may come along at some point in time.
Out of curiosity, how big is the lag time between the publication of the 2 volumes you just told us about and their publication in digital form on your website?
With the documents that are in these individual volumes, there's annotation explaining the context and some of the references in the documents, and also historical introductions that set up the documents. Some of these documents are online already as what we call interim content, meaning they haven't received the full editorial treatment that all of our documents will receive, but we have put them online anyway. But as for all the content that's in each volume, we put that up online 18 months after the print volume comes out. So Journals Volume 3 will come out later this year. 18 months later, that full content will be available for free online.
Great. Thank you for that information. Where is the best place to look for more information about you, the Joseph Smith Papers, and how to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so for the Joseph Smith Papers, it's our website, josephsmithpapers.org. And if someone wants to get in contact with me, I would invite them to visit my personal website at www.spencerwmcbride.com, or they could email me at smcbride@ldschurch.org.
And you're active on Twitter, right?
I am, and I always welcome followers and interaction in that space.
Well, Spencer, thank you so much for helping us explore the life and times of Joseph Smith and the Joseph Smith Papers documentary editing project.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure to speak with you about it.
I enjoyed our chat with Spencer and his insights on Joseph Smith and the founding of Mormonism. One of the most fascinating aspects of the post-revolution New England migration into New York, at least for me, is how the Yankee migrants and their children participated in many of the reform movements and in the Second Great Awakening that took place during the early Republic. In fact, Joseph Smith tried to start his Mormon community in Western New York, a region that revivalist Charles Grandison Finney dubbed the Burned Over District. And he called it the Burned Over District because there's so many different religious revivals and movements that are getting their start and spreading their message across the state. And early Republic New York didn't just witness the start of Mormonism. It also witnessed the start of the Millerites, and it had very active communities of Methodists, Shakers, and people who wanted to start utopian societies, like the one at Oneida. There's so many groups that I've missed. If reform and religious activity in the early Republic fascinates you, and you're particularly fascinated with New York, you should read Whitney Cross's The Burned Over District. It's a really good book on the subject. You can find more information about Spencer, the Joseph Smith Papers documentary editing project, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/045. Did you enjoy having episodes with different histories on the same period air back to back to back, as episodes 43, 44, and 45 did? Please let me know. I am always experimenting and thinking about ways I can make Ben Franklin's World more enjoyable for you. You can let me know your thoughts by sending an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweeting me @LizCovart, or leaving a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in Poor Richard's Club, the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. If you are not a member of Poor Richard's Club, and you love the idea of hanging out with me and over 150 other fellow history lovers, you should visit benfranklinsworld.com and sign up for the Franklin Gazette newsletter, which contains a link to the community. Or you can text BF World to 33444. Now, I know I'm partial, but I love Poor Richard's Club. And today is a perfect example of why I love it. Not only did I wake up this morning and post a bunch of different history articles that we could talk about, but members of the community posted interesting things that I hadn't seen that they found. For example, Patrick found an article in BBC History magazine about a documentary series that the BBC is doing on the Hanoverian monarchs. He even posted a link to an episode on YouTube that discusses King George I and a link to the one that discusses King George II. Michael posted pictures from his vacation, and this is a man after my own heart. He has gone out into the Western New York area, and he is charting Sullivan's expedition of 1779. He's visiting sites associated with that expedition, and when I asked him about it, he gave me a whole list of books that he read in preparation for his trip, which is perfect because I'll be working on Sullivan's expedition when I revise my next book chapter. So those are just some of the reasons I love Poor Richard's Club, and I hope you'll join me there. Again, you can sign up by texting BF World to 33444 or by visiting the website and signing up for the Franklin Gazette.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.